Today I'll be going over China's economic slowdown. So a brief introduction to China and its economy. So China, just a few decades ago, after it was war-torn by World War II and when the Communist Party took over, it was very similar to modern-day North Korea. The country was isolated. People's quality of life was very poor. Some couldn't afford food. There was massive starvation. And it wasn't until Deng Xiaoping took over that when he introduced China to the rest of the world, he opened up China. It was actually during one of his visits to Singapore where he saw Chinese Singaporeans and how well they were doing and how great the city in Singapore was that he decided to open up China. And since the 1990s, China has experienced unprecedented growth. Their annual GDP growth rate hitting double digits almost every single year. Yeah, they just transformed overnight from being from one of the poorest countries in the world to becoming the second largest economy and the world's largest exporter. However, in recent years, China has seen economic slowdown and issues in their economy. I have narrowed these down to 6 in total. The first and major one being the COVID-19 pandemic, which has not only impacted China, but the whole world and many other countries. There has been the Evergrande crisis, the energy shortage, the demand shortage, which was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has now led to a supply chain shock. Well, the supply chain shortage. And then there's also been the Suez Canal and the CCP crackdown and reforms. So here is China's GDP from 1980 to 2020. As you can see from the 1990s up until 2010 over here, there was a rapid increase in China's GDP. And as you can see right over here in recent years that it started to flatten out. And then the next chart here, you'll be able to see it more easily. So right over here, I have China's annual GDP growth rate. And this data is from the 1980 to 2020. And as you can see over here, the GDP growth rate percentage from 1990s over here, it's been hitting double digits. And when it's dipped, it's went right back up. And after the 2008 financial crisis, China has steadily started to pull back. And just last year, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as you can see, it's dropped to just right above 2%, which has not been seen since 1990. It is very absurd how far it's dropped. I'd like to point out this is only in the short term due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but there's still been a downtrend, as you can see. And this is most likely also due to China's declining exports. As you can see, China has been nicknamed the world's factory. And as you can see from this graph, it's a pretty accurate name. China has increased their exports exponentially. But however, in recent years, it started to drop off. As you can see, around 2013, they hit a peak of 2.5 billion. 2.5 trillion. And over here, 7 years later, it's not been any better. Whereas the early years, you see the rapid increase. This, as you can also see down here, the percentage of exports that make up the total GDP has also started to decrease. This is also most likely due to the energy shortage that China has been experiencing in recent years. So a lot of people don't know this, but there's actually been a huge energy crisis in China. This is mainly due to 2 reasons. So the main reason, in my opinion, is because of the CCP reform. So CCP promised to reduce their carbon footprint and become carbon neutral by 2060 and actually hit their peak carbon footprint by 2030. So the CCP made several comments on that in the Paris Climate Accord and then the G7 summit. So they are trying to hit their targets and reduce energy consumption because around 90% of China's energy is produced from coal, which has a huge carbon footprint. And the second issue is with regards to coal is that their trade with Australia has decreased drastically. China used to get a lot of their coal from Australia. However, due to political conflicts, it's led to trade embargoes and trade restrictions. So China restricted Australian wine, Australian beef, and most importantly, Australian coal, which has been supplying a lot of China's energy. And so what this means is that China can only get their coal from Inner Mongolia now. And the coal mines in Inner Mongolia aren't set up as well, and the supply is not as great, and the quality is also not as great. And so what that means is the coal is really expensive now in China, and very scarce. So many cities are actually shutting down the power grid to decrease energy consumption, and also because they just don't have any energy, so they just have to shut it down. And so what this means for China is that many of the industrial cities have been impacted on top of the livelihood of regular civilians. And some have estimated China's GDP to be impacted as much as 0.4% from these energy outages, which is insane. And following that is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has impacted not just China, but the whole world. But China is arguably the nation that took the most drastic measures. So the CCP ordered many cities to shut down, isolating millions of people. The most popular example being in Wuhan. When the crisis broke, China's government cracked down really hard. They closed the whole city. The city almost became a ghost city. Everyone was inside. If you were caught going outside for non-essential purposes, you're essentially, some even for essential purposes, you're essentially just arrested. And yeah. However, even with the crackdowns and the shutdowns, there still have been cases popping up here and there throughout China, which has led to further shutdowns of cities and areas, which there has been two sides to this argument. Some argue that China's actions have actually helped their economy. It's reduced a lot of their spread. And yeah, however, the other side is saying that due to the shutdowns, it's actually caused China a lot of economic damage. So there are those two sides. However, something for certain is that it has led to weakened demand overall globally. And with weakened demand and China as the world's main exporter, it's clear that how China is impacted. So during the initial during the initial phases of COVID, a lot of nations and companies canceled a lot of orders in China. So China, the suppliers in China decreased a lot of their output, decreased a lot of their future projections. And then, however, demand rapidly picked up faster than expected, but the supply couldn't keep up now. They've already planned expecting very low demand. And this actually led to a supply chain crisis due to the rapid pickup in demand and other issues such as the Suez Canal crisis, which blocked the Suez Canal. There's been a rapid decrease in exports, even though demand is there. An example of how bad this is before the pandemic, one freight from China to the US, west coast of US, would cost around $1,000. Now it would cost, I looked it up, it was upwards of 8,000, some even hitting $10,000, which is 8 to 10-fold more expensive, which is absolutely insane. And next up will be the Evergrande crisis. So China is very peculiar, as real estate makes up a very large portion of their economy. In 2016, it was estimated almost a quarter of China's GDP came from real estate. And so this is very dangerous if such a large company as Evergrande defaults on their debt and collapses. And this almost happened and is still in the phases of potentially happening in China, as Evergrande, one of China's largest real estate firms, is currently failing to pay a lot of its debt. And if it actually defaults on all of its debt, this will cause a spiral effect. A lot of people are invested in Evergrande. The investors will lose their money. People who apply for Evergrande's financial services, which we also have, will lose out on their money. They can't withdraw that. Their employees will not get paid. Some have not been paid for 6 months. They can't pay off their contractors. The contractors can't pay off their employees. Their employees can't pay off rent and other people and their groceries. So this will just lead in a constant spiral and possibly an economic collapse and like just another recession. And this is also highlighted China's unstable housing market. Many Chinese prefer to invest in real estate rather than stocks and other investments, which arguably this has caused a bubble in their housing market, which is extremely dangerous. And so what's likely going to happen now? Well, China's annual GDP growth will continue to decrease in the foreseeable future, in the next following few years, which isn't necessarily bad, which I'll go over later. And they'll also make a shift away from exports. So there's most likely going to be a further transition away from exports, as you can see from the previous, if you remember from the previous graph I had, in the early 2000s to mid 2000s, exports made up over 30% of China's GDP, and now it makes up around 20%, and now most likely further fall. This is actually a good thing, as it symbolizes that China is transitioning away from production, like industrial production, which is very similar to what happened to the US when it transitioned away more into the service areas, service industries. The supply chain issue will most likely persist longer. A lot of experts have estimated that will continue until 2023 at least. A lot of tech parts, sought after tech parts, will most likely still be in huge shortage, such as GPU, chips, and wafers that are utilized to make chips. And yeah, there's most likely going to still be a shortage of those. And so what should policymakers do? Well, they should acquire a more reliable energy source other than coal. They need to transition that infrastructure away from coal. China has been building a lot of dams. They could create more solar panel farms, wind power farms, stuff like that. They also need to transition away from real estate as a leading component in their GDP. And they also need to impose regulations on these real estate companies. The reason why Evergrande was able to reach such a devastating state was because they were able to take out tons of loans, and they just expanded way too fast and almost collapsed on top of itself. And these two I'll be going over in the next slide. So in conclusion, China is not the only country impacted by COVID. And I do take into account that part of their economic slowdown is due to COVID. And economic slowdown for such a big country is normal. It's every first world country has gone through these phases. The US was very similar. In its early phases, the GDP was extremely high, and now it started to slow down, which is extremely normal for when a country is developed. However, the most important aspect that I want to go over is the issue is not the slowdown, but a decrease in class mobility. Now, an economic slowdown is normal, but the quality of life for citizens is the most important. And in my opinion, China's government isn't doing enough to ensure the quality of life for these citizens, because several cities in China are so expensive to purchase a house and just like live normally in them. In their cities, a lot of their costs are really high, and it's estimated that I think it was 600 million Chinese people are living almost in poverty, and it is insane to see that when a country is so wealthy and there's such a huge wage disparity and wealth disparity. And that is pretty much it from me. Thank you for watching, and I'll be signing off now. And here are my citations.